Quite some time ago now, I did a video on USS Borie, an antique old four-stacker destroyer best known for one thing and one thing only: her legendary battle with a German submarine, one that was quite up close and personal for all involved, probably closer than anyone would have liked. That story is a popular one these days, although the situation she ended up in was as much an accident as anything. That doesn't take anything away from her crew and their heroism, of course, nor that of the German sailors who fought back against them. It's why I'm doing this video focused entirely on that battle, something akin to my recent video on Mikuma's sinking. A narrower focus than normal, but then that's not a bad thing. It certainly lets me put more focus on Borie's legendary battle. And if anything, this is longer than the original video, which we can get into now with a little bit of background. Because to understand that fight, it is important to understand Borie's situation. She was, as noted, an old four-stacker destroyer, a Clemson to be specific, that was 23 years old by 1943, when most of the ship's class had been relegated to second-line duty. For her part, Borie was used on convoy escorts, for the most part. Her final convoy was in early 1943, with the ship assigned to a hunter-killer group by June of that year. She would serve alongside her sisters, USS Goff and Barry, with all three under the command of the escort carrier USS Card. With this group, Borie went on 4 patrols from June through October of 1943. Those patrols proved to be largely successful, to the point that the group as a whole earned a Presidential Unit Citation. However, these patrols were all leading up to Borie's final mission, because during the final patrol, she found another U-boat. On the night of October 31st, 1943, Borie caught the submarine U-256 on the surface with her radar. With metaphorical blood in the water, the old four-stacker closed in. To the credit of the German crew, they were quick to crash dive, even when caught by surprise. Not that it would help them much. Borie's crew proved quite good with their depth charges, forcing U-256 back to the surface after 2 runs. This after their sonar was temporarily knocked out, before 10 minutes of frantic work brought it back online. While the U-boat managed to submerge again, the damage done to her was severe. So severe that the oil slick left behind was taken as a successful strike by Borie's crew after a 3rd depth charge run. As it would turn out, the Germans managed to limp home. Nonetheless, Borie's captain, Charles Hutchins, was not content. He radioed in, "Scratch 1 pig boat 11 miles south of your position. Am searching for more," and would do just that. Around 2 a.m. on November 1st, Borie got another radar contact. This submarine would prove a bit more of a challenge. Under the aggressive command of her captain, the youngest destroyer skipper in the Navy, Borie charged toward the enemy. For those wondering, Hutchins was only 30 years old at the time. In spite of losing radar contact at 2,800 yards, the destroyer had her nose to the target. Sonar quickly picked up the Germans again, allowing Borie to launch depth charges. The seas were quite rough, with 15-foot waves and high wind. I can only imagine how miserable being in a Clemson in that kind of weather would have been. To say the least, This wasn't a class known for being fun in a calm sea, let alone that kind of stormy weather. Borie would have been thrown around by waves that high. Even so, the crew seemed to have hardly noticed as they depth charged the Germans. I wish I could say their accurate fire continued here, but that would be less accurate and less fun. What actually happened was Borie's depth charge racks malfunctioning, dumping her entire load of stern depth charges in one go. This succeeded in lifting the destroyer's stern out of the water and drove the German U-boat to the surface. Borie is very fortunate that this didn't cause damage to the ship. Etzel dropped depth charges at too shallow a depth and damaged her stern because of this. Meanwhile, the U-boat U-405 came up within 400 yards of Borie, point-blank range for all intents and purposes. Borie's radar gave a bearing and her searchlight sprang to life. Her guns immediately opened fire whenever they had a good angle. Both the 4-inch main battery and new 20mm cannon. The two ships were so close to one another that Borie's crew could make out the insignia on the U-boat's conning tower. Now, in most any other surface action, Borie would have been outmatched. She was old and obsolescent. Her main battery of 4-inch guns was quite light by the standards of Second World War destroyers. However, against a U-boat on the surface, it was quite sufficient. Brutally so. The first salvo from the 4-inch guns blasted U-405's deck gun clean off the submarine. The 20mm guns, meanwhile, slashed the German conning tower. Aside from a few 20mm rounds, the U-boat was completely unable to fire back. When the crew tried, they were cut down by Borie. As this was happening, the U-boat frantically tried to get away. She could turn better than the notoriously fickle old four-stacker, but Borie managed to stay right with the Germans. Hutchins kept his destroyer next to the U-boat, continuing to pound away. At one point, the Germans might have been trying to surrender. They shot off flares, and a sailor on the conning tower waved his hands at the Americans. Hutchins took this as an attempt to surrender and ordered his crew to cease fire. Unfortunately, as happens in the fog of war, mistakes were made. One of the gun captains on Borie had removed his headphones and didn't hear the ceasefire order. His crew promptly, they blew the German sailor's head away. From what I've read, this wasn't an intentional move to ignore orders, though I also haven't read anything on why he removed the headphones. So make of this what you will. The fight continued on at that point, as you could probably expect. Things were soon to change, however, as Hutchins grew impatient. In spite of his fine seamanship, the U-boat was fundamentally more agile, and he couldn't know for sure if it was damaged to the point where it could no longer submerge. As such, he gave the classic order: stand by for a ram. USS Borie, working up to 25 knots, rammed into the starboard side of U-405. Unfortunately for all involved, this was anything but a clean ram. Remember those 15-foot waves that I mentioned earlier? One of those rose up at the very last moment and lifted up Borie. Instead of slicing into the side of the U-boat, Borie's bow ended up wedged on top of the deck. Stuck at a 30-degree angle, the destroyer and the U-boat were locked together for 10 minutes. Borie's crew had drilled for a similar circumstance of a U-boat ramming their port side as recently as October 27th. It's one of the great ironies of war, really. Could any crew have expected something like this? No. But Borie had trained for something similar enough and recently enough that the crew was prepared. As prepared as they could ever be anyway. They leapt into action without any orders, grabbing every weapon they could get their hands on. Thompsons, shotguns, pistols, and even, reportedly, a flare gun at one point. While the gun crews tried to work their weapons, the rest of the crew, engineers aside, opened fire. The Germans did much the same from open hatches. However, every time a German crewman tried to man a larger gun, he was cut down. In most cases, this was done by Borie's own guns and her gun crew, or the motley collection of firearms that the rest of the crew had gathered up. In at least 3 cases, however, it was by more unique means. First, a fireman first class, David Southwick, threw a knife at a German sailor. This was from less than 10 yards and killed the German. Reportedly, the knife hit his chest and the man tumbled into the water. For the second incident, another of Borie's crew, Walter Cruz, threw a 4-inch shell casing, knocking a German sailor into the water. And in the final case, another crewman, who isn't named, fired a flare pistol, supposedly hitting another German sailor square in the chest. The knife and the shell casing are pretty well reported. The flare gun less so, though I include it for completion's sake. All 3 probably happened, but how accurate the claims are to reality, no one will ever know. I doubt even Borie's crew knew really. That mess was too chaotic to be sure. I can believe that something along the lines of this happened, but for the sake of the historical record, it's impossible to say with absolute certainty. And I'm taking nothing from Borie's crew in saying this, because they did fight hard. And with everything they could find, don't forget that. Through all of this, Borie's engineers did the best they could to keep the ship afloat. Her old plates were buckling, and the stress of the ram was killing the destroyer. It buckled the entire port side and flooded the forward engine room. In an act of bravery, her engineers and damage control team kept the engine room running, in neck-deep water, while another engineer, Irving Somm, dived under 10 feet of water to shut a flooding drain. Eventually, however, the two broke apart. U-405 was still capable of outturning Borie, even as the searchlight kept her illuminated. More 4-inch fire was thrown her way, but the U-boat kept going. She even attempted to use her stern torpedo tube. Hutchins, at this point, wisely shut off the destroyer's searchlight. The goal was to avoid a torpedo, but also to trick U-405 into attempting an escape. Radar was enough to keep the surface submarine in Borie's sight. And as such, the plan worked. Borie worked up to 27 knots in spite of her damage and the continuing high waves. She would light up the U-boat for a final time. U-405 tried to ram the destroyer in a mirror of the earlier action, but Hutchins avoided the attempt. Borie let loose more depth charges. Those perfectly straddled U-405's conning tower and detonated at a depth of 30 feet. Some reports claim that the U-boat practically jumped from the water due to the force of the explosion. Meanwhile, Borie fired more shells until U-405 finally surrendered. It just took a 4-inch shell, blasting her starboard exhaust to pieces. while another shell wrecked the conning tower and probably killed the U-boat's captain. In any case, 15 or so of the U-boat's crew made it into life rafts as their submarine sank. I've seen as high as 19 or 20, with U-405 vanishing just before 3 a.m. on November 1st, 1943. The crew would, unfortunately, never be rescued. It's hard to say it isn't their own fault in the event. Borie had moved to pick up the German survivors, but they continued to fire flares and star shells from the raft. Hutchins assumed it was a distress signal, and in fairness, it was. However, it was directed at a different target. Another star shell came up in the distance, followed by a torpedo nearly hitting Borie. It came so close that the crew could see the wake alongside the destroyer. A destroyer that, let's recall, was still fighting flooding. U-405's crew had been signaling another surface U-boat nearby. With his destroyer already suffering, Hutchins made the decision to leave. Borie would be forced to evade, unfortunately turning right through the survivors' rafts. I should note that there's no indication this was an intentional move. Not like, say, the Japanese submarine I-12, which very deliberately surfaced to run down survivors. Borie didn't intend to run down the German sailors, but in the process of trying to pick them up, she was too close, and the Germans paid the price. While whoever that other U-boat was, it never picked up the survivors either, leaving U-405's crew to their fate. In this final act of defiance, those survivors doomed themselves. As for Borie, the destroyer sailed off at 10 knots. Her damage was severe and arguably fatal. Her crew fought valiantly to keep their destroyer afloat. They threw everything overboard short of the main battery, and even then, they only left 10 shells per gun. The crew pumped out as much water as they could, but they couldn't fight the rising tide. Eventually, trailing oil and with the waves climbing to 20 feet, Hutchins had to order abandoned ship. Her communications officer used lighter fluid and alcohol from a torpedo to get the radio working. Goff and Barry would answer the call for help and took off Borie's crew on the night of November 1st, 1943. During the engagement with U-405, none of Borie's crew would perish. Several were wounded, but none were killed. In the evacuation of the foundering destroyer, 3 officers and 24 men drowned. A sad end to what had been a successful action to that point. Still, 125 men and 4 officers would be rescued. Borie, meanwhile, stubbornly remained afloat into the next morning. It took the combined efforts of her sister ships and aircraft from USS Card to finally sink her on November 2nd, 1943. Her story is one that deserves remembering, to say the least. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.